Okay, so I want you to imagine, if you can, a man standing in a crowded room. We're talking the late 17th century.
So already a different world.
A completely different world. And this isn't just any man. This guy is um, a literal physical anomaly. He is 6 feet 8 inches tall.
6'8", which, let's be honest, is huge even by modern standards.
Oh, absolutely.
But in the 1600s.
Right, when the average height was maybe, what, 5'5". He's basically an NBA center walking among, I don't know, toddlers?
He's a giant, a second Goliath.
Exactly. And he's not just standing there calmly. He's twitching. He has these uncontrollable facial tics, maybe a neck spasm that jerks his head to the side when he gets excited or angry.
So he's not just imposing, he's unsettling.
He is terrifying, he is brilliant, and he is just vibrating with his energy that is about to tear his country apart and then put it all back together again.
It is such a striking image, and it's not a fictional character. We are talking about Peter the First, Peter the Great.
The man himself.
And that physical description, the sheer scale of the man, the nervous energy, the violence of his movement, it's almost a perfect metaphor for his entire reign.
It really is.
He was a force of nature that physically and, figuratively dragged Russia, kicking and screaming, out of the medieval era and into the modern world.
Exactly. And that is what we are digging into today. We are looking at a stack of historical records, biographical details, and various accounts of his reign to unpack the absolute paradox of this man.
Because he really is a man of two halves.
Completely. On one hand, you have the enlightened creator, right? The visionary who built St. Petersburg out of a swamp, who gave Russia a navy, who brought in science and museums.
All the things that made Russia a European power.
But on the other hand, to get those things, you have a brutal, and I mean brutal, autocrat. A man who personally oversaw the torture of his enemies, who mocked the church in the most grotesque ways imaginable.
And who, and this is the darkest part, presided over the torture and death of his own son.
Yeah, that part it's heavy. We're definitely going to get there. The mission for this deep dive is to try and figure out, was he the savior of Russia? Or was he, as some of his subjects literally called him, the Antichrist?
It's a question they were asking then, and we're still asking now.
So let's go back to the beginning. Because Peter wasn't born expecting to be the sole emperor. Not by a long shot.
No, far from it. And to understand Peter, you really have to understand the chaos he was born into. He enters the world in 1672. When his father, Tsar Alexis, dies, the throne doesn't go to Peter.
Right, he had an older brother.
He had older half-brothers. The throne goes to the eldest, Fyodor III. But Fyodor is sickly, which is a very common theme in the Romanov line at this time, and he dies young without an heir.
And that's when things get messy.
That's when you get a Game of Thrones situation breaking out in Moscow. Suddenly, it's a power vacuum.
Right. You've got these two rival families here. You have the Moleslavskis, who are the family of the first wife.
And the Narishkins, who are Peter's mother's family. And this isn't just some polite disagreement over who should rule. This is blood in the streets.
You're not kidding.
No, this conflict turns violent, and it turns violent fast. We're talking about the Streltsy Uprising in 1682. The Streltsy were the elite military corps. You can think of them as musketeers with a very strong union and a lot of political leverage.
So not people you want to upset.
The last people you want to upset. And they revolt, fueled by rumors that the Narishkins had poisoned the previous Tsar. They storm the Kremlin. And Peter's just 10 years old.
10. I mean, pause there for a second. A 10-year-old boy.
He is standing on the red staircase of the Kremlin, and he watches as his own family members, his uncles, his mother's friends, are dragged out and murdered on the pikes of these soldiers.
Just impaled in front of him.
Some accounts say he saw his protector, a man named Artemon Matviev, literally torn apart right in front of him. That kind of trauma, it doesn't just go away. It shapes your entire worldview.
It's probably where those dicks came from.
It's very likely where those facial tics and convulsions came from later in life. He learned a lesson that day, a brutal one. Safety is an illusion. And power, raw, physical, undeniable force is the only thing that actually matters.
And the result of all this bloodshed is one of the weirdest political arrangements in history. Because neither side could fully wipe the other out, they have to compromise.
So they decide, okay, we'll have two czars.
Which is just wild.
It's the dual throne. It's a fascinating artifact. You can actually see it in the Kremlin Armory today. It's this massive, double-seated velvet throne.
So who sat where?
On one side sat Ivan V, Peter's half-brother from the rival Miloslavsky family. Ivan was technically the senior czar, but he was described as weak-minded, he was nearly blind, and he could barely walk.
Okay, so a figurehead.
Essentially. And on the other side sat the 10-year-old Peter.
But the best part Or the creepiest part is the hole, right? You have to tell them about the hole.
The hole is the key detail. Cut into the back of the throne, behind the boys, was a concealed opening masked by the velvet. And their older sister, the Regent Sophia,
The real power broker.
the real power broker at this time, an incredibly sharp and ambitious woman, she would sit behind them, completely hidden, and she would listen to the ambassadors and the nobles and then whisper instructions to the boys.
Say this, do that.
Don't agree to that. Exactly. She was literally the power behind the throne.
But eventually, Sophia's influence pushes Peter out. He and his mother get, well, basically banished from the Kremlin. They're sent to an estate called Preobrazhensky.
And honestly, looking back at the sources, this seems like the best thing that could have possibly happened to him.
How so?
Well, if Peter had stayed in the Kremlin, he would have been suffocated by court ritual, by religious ceremony, by the heavy brocade robes of the boyars. He might have just turned out to be another figurehead.
Just another Ivan's V.
Exactly, but in Preobrazhensky, he was wild, he was free, and crucially, he was right next to the German quarter.
The German quarter. This is where all the foreign expats lived, right? The engineers, the merchants.
Yes. It was a suburb of Moscow called Nemetskaya Sloboda. Nemetz, in Russian, basically meant mute, as in someone who couldn't speak Russian, so it just applied to all foreigners. Dutch, English, Germans, Scots.
And Peter became obsessed with this place.
Completely. He realized that these foreigners knew things that Russians just didn't. Practical things, tangible things.
Like what?
Well, they knew how to build ships that could sail against the wind. They knew mathematics. They understood fortification. They had astrolabes and compasses. And for a teenage Peter, the Kremlin was full of incense and chanting, which didn't really do anything.
Right.
The German quarter, on the other hand, was full of machines and maps that worked. It was a world of applied knowledge.
And he didn't just read about it. He starts building what the history books call his toy army. But I feel like the word toy is really misleading here.
Very misleading. Play regiments might be a better translation, but even that is too soft. He recruited hundreds of boys, sons of nobles, but also stable boys, servants, anyone he could find, and organized them into actual regiments.
With uniforms and everything.
Uniforms, real gunpowder, real muskets, and real cannons.
And didn't they do like live fire drills? Weren't people getting hurt?
Oh, absolutely. They conducted mock battles and sieges that were so realistic people actually got hurt and sometimes died. A grenade would go off too close or a cannon would misfire.
That's insane.
Peter didn't care about the safety. He cared about the realism of the simulation. And here's the crucial insight. Inside these regiments, birth rank didn't matter one bit.
Oh, that's interesting.
You could be a prince, but if you couldn't load a musket properly, you were a private. If a stable boy turned out to be a natural tactician, he became an officer.
So that's the seed of his entire meritocracy right there in this teenage war game.
Exactly. He was building a prototype of the Russia he wanted to create. Efficient, militarized, and based entirely on competence, not on your bloodline.
It's all about what you can do, not who your father was.
He preferred drumming to music. He wanted to know how a cannon worked, not how to wear a silk robe correctly.
There's this great detail in the notes that he found an old English boat in a storage shed somewhere, had it restored, and taught himself to sail.
He fell in love with it. He was a natural sailor.
But he also wanted to learn everything else. He learned Dutch. He learned carpentry. It's like he was trying to manually download the entire skill set of Western Europe into his own brain.
And that outsider upbringing is so vital. He didn't care for the long beards and the heavy kaftans of the Russian boyars, the nobility. He saw all of that as symbols of backwardness, of stagnation.
If you could build a ship, he was your friend.
If you could build a ship or fire a cannon, Peter liked you. It didn't matter who your father was or how long your beard was.
So let's fast forward a bit. He eventually wrests power from his sister Sophia in 1689.
She gets sent to a convent, naturally. That's what you did with inconvenient women in royal families back then.
Of course. And then his mother dies, his co-Tsar Ivan dies, and by 1696, Peter is finally the sole ruler of Russia. And he looks around at his country and realizes, we are behind, like centuries behind.
It wasn't just a feeling, it was a geopolitical reality. Russia was isolated. It was landlocked for all intents and purposes. Its only real port was way up north in Arkhangelsk on the White Sea.
Which is frozen solid for, what, 6 months of the year?
Or more. You can't run a modern empire if your main trade route is an ice sheet half the time. He wants access to the Black Sea to the south, which means fighting the Ottoman Empire.
A huge undertaking.
Massive. He has some mixed success taking the fortress of Azov using river ships that he built himself, basically.
Sure.
But he realizes very quickly that Russia can't do this alone. The Ottoman Empire is a superpower. He needs allies, and more importantly, he needs better technology.
So he decides to go on a road trip. The Grand Embassy. This is honestly one of my favorite parts of history because it just sounds like a sitcom premise.
It really does.
The Tsar of Russia leaves the country for 18 months to tour Europe. But he doesn't go as the Tsar. He goes incognito.
Under the name Peter Mikhailov, his official rank was sergeant.
Which is hilarious because, again, the guy is 6'8". He's traveling with a massive entourage. He's twice the size of everyone else. He's twitching, and he's probably shouting orders. How do you think he was fooling anyone?
Well, he wasn't really, not for a second. Most of the monarchs and officials knew exactly who he was, but the incognito status was a brilliant diplomatic hack.
How so?
It allowed him to bypass all the boring, time-wasting protocols. If he visits as the Tsar, he has to sit through endless state banquets, listen to 3-hour speeches, wear the heavy robes. As Sergeant Peter Mikhailov, he can just sneak out the back door and go visit a shipyard.
Which is exactly what he wanted to do.
It's all he wanted to do, and that's exactly what he did. He ends up in the Netherlands, in places like Zaandam and Amsterdam, and he gets a job. The ruler of the Russian Empire is working as a carpenter's apprentice on a Dutch wharf.
Living in a little log cabin.
Lived in a log cabin, bought his own tools. He insisted on being treated like a regular worker by the Dutch shipwrights. If they addressed him as Your Majesty, he'd get angry. He wanted to learn the hands-on physics of bending wood and caulking hulls.
But his curiosity was boundless. It wasn't just ships.
No, it was everything. He was a true polymath. He visited Friedrich Riesch, the famous anatomist.
I read about this. He was fascinated by the dissections.
He learned how to preserve specimens in jars. He learned how to catch and pin butterflies. He was just captivated by the idea that the world could be categorized and understood through science, not just through superstition and prayer.
And we have to talk about the dentistry.
Oh, yes, the dentistry. Unfortunately for his court, he became obsessed with the mechanics of pulling teeth. He bought a set of dental pliers, and the sources say he would carry around a bag of teeth that he'd pulled from his, let's say, willing subject.
So if you're a courtier and you have a toothache,
you learn to keep your mouth shut around Peter, or he'd come at you with the pliers. And he wasn't exactly a trained professional.
that is genuinely terrifying.
Wow.
But then he moves on to England, right?
He does. He spends several months in London. He visits the Royal Mint and is amazed by the recoinage process. He may have even met Isaac Newton, who was warden of the Mint.
Wow.
He meets King William III. He inspects the dockyards at Deptford. But we also have to touch on the sheer destructive energy of Peter and his entourage.
Oh, this is the story about John Evelyn's house.
Yes. They rented a beautiful estate from John Evelyn, who was a famous writer and gardener, and they basically trashed the place like a rock band in a hotel room.
What did they do?
It was carnage. They used the family portraits for target practice with their muskets. They dragged grease and ink all over the floors. They reportedly used expensive silk curtains for, let's just say, hygiene purposes.
Oh.
And Peter's favorite pastime was to have his friends push him in a wheelbarrow at full speed through Evelyn's prized holly hedges.
Wait, he had people push him in a wheelbarrow through hedges? Just for fun?
Just smashing through them. It's this bizarre, almost unbelievable mix of high intellect and almost animalistic chaos. But beneath all the partying and destruction, he was recruiting.
Right, this was a business trip.
Absolutely. He hired hundreds of specialists, shipwrights, engineers, naval officers, surgeons, promising them huge salaries to come back to Russia with him. As you said before, he was essentially stealing the source code of Western civilization to install it back home.
But the vacation had to end. He gets word of another Streltsy rebellion back in Moscow. So he has to rush back in 1698.
And if the Grand Embassy was the fun, educational part of the story, what happens next is the horror movie part.
It gets dark.
It was a bloodbath. The rebellion had actually already been crushed by his generals before he even arrived, but Peter wasn't satisfied with that. He felt the old Russia trying to pull him back to undo his work.
He wanted to send a message.
A message that would echo for centuries. He initiated a massive new investigation. Over 1,000 Streltsy were rounded up, tortured, and executed.
You're not talking about a quick firing squad.
No. This was medieval stuff. Breaking on the wheel, beheading, mass hangings. The bodies were left on display for months as a warning. And Peter personally participated in the executions.
He took up an axe himself.
He took an axe and chopped off heads. And he forced his courtiers, these soft, robed nobles who had probably never held an axe in their lives, to do the same. Imagine the psychological terror of that. He was making them complicit. He was baptizing them in blood into his new order.
And then, the very morning after he returns, still covered in the dust of Europe, he starts the Cultural Revolution. He starts cutting off beards.
Quite literally, he gathers his nobles, and while they're all kneeling to welcome him home, he pulls out a pair of shears and starts hacking off their long, flowing beards.
You have to understand, in Russian Orthodoxy at the time, the beard was sacred.
It was everything. It was a sign of being made in God's image. To shave it was considered a grave sin. It was a massive loss of identity and piety.
But Peter didn't care one bit. He said, shave it or pay up.
The beard tax. It's one of the most famous and frankly bizarre taxes in history. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay a tax. And it was quite expensive for the nobility.
And you got a little token.
You did. A special copper token that you had to carry to prove you'd paid. And it said on it, the beard is a superfluous burden.
Wow.
It was a violent, symbolic break from the past. And it wasn't just the beards. He also banned the traditional long robes and forced everyone at court to wear German or Hungarian-style jackets. He was forcing them to look like the foreigners they had always been taught to despise.
So he's reshaped the look of his people. He's crushed his enemies. Now he wants to reshape the map itself. We talked about the Black Sea, but that didn't work out perfectly. So his focus shifts north.
His focus shifts to the Baltic Sea. He needs a reliable port. He needs a window to the west.
Which brings us to the Great Northern War.
This was the defining conflict of his reign. It lasted for 21 years. It was a massive gamble. He went to war against Sweden.
Which people forget was the absolute superpower of the North at the time.
Totally. They had the best, most professional army in Europe. They were led by King Charles XII, who was this teenage military genius. Peter, on the other hand, thought it would be a cakewalk.
It was definitely not a cakewalk.
No. The Battle of Narva in 1700 was an absolute catastrophe for Russia, a complete humiliation. The Russian army was destroyed by a much smaller Swedish force in a blinding snowstorm.
They lost all their artillery.
Almost all of it was captured by the Swedes. It was an unmitigated disaster.
But this is where Peter's personality kicks in. Most leaders would sue for peace, maybe quit. Peter just says, okay, we need better cannons, go melt down the church bells.
Exactly. He didn't wallow in defeat for a second. He stripped the bells from the churches, which again horrified the faithful and had them cast into new guns. He used the defeat as a lesson. He radically overhauled the army, adopting Swedish tactics, improving training.
And while the Swedes were busy fighting in Poland,
Peter creeps back to the Baltic coast. And in 1703, on a swampy, miserable island in the Neva River Delta, he decides to build a city.
St. Petersburg. The city famously built on bones.
It was an insane place to build a capital city. It was a mosquito-infested marsh. It flooded constantly. There were no stones. There was no timber nearby. Everything had to be imported.
So how did he build it?
With forced labor. He conscripted tens of thousands of peasants and prisoners of war and forced them to work in appalling conditions. They were digging canals and laying foundations with their bare hands sometimes. Thousands died of dysentery, malaria, exhaustion.
And the detail about how he got the building materials is just wild. He forbade stone buildings anywhere else in Russia, is that right?
Yes. It's an incredible display of autocratic power. He issued a decree: no new stone buildings in Moscow or anywhere else in the entire empire. If you were a stonemason, you were out of a job unless you moved to St. Petersburg.
He cornered the market on stonemasons.
He did. And he established a stone tax. Every cart or ship entering the city had to bring a certain number of stones with them as a toll. He forced the nobility to move there against their will and build lavish palaces in a style they didn't understand.
And all the while, he himself lived in a tiny log cabin.
A modest 3-room log cabin while demanding they build a European metropolis around him.
It's like if the U.S. president decided to build a new capital in the middle of the Florida Everglades and banned concrete everywhere else in the country just to make it happen.
That is a perfect analogy. And the nobles hated it. It was cold, it was damp, it was expensive. But Peter loved it because it was his paradise. It was a blank slate. Moscow was old, traditional Russia. St. Petersburg was the future.
And eventually, the war turns in his favor. 1709, the Battle of Poltava.
The great turning point. Charles XII of Sweden invades Russia, a mistake that Napoleon and Hitler would later repeat. His army is weakened by the brutal Russian winter, and at Poltava, Peter's new modernized army absolutely crushes the Swedes.
A decisive victory.
Decisive is an understatement. Charles XII flees to the Ottoman Empire. Russia effectively replaces Sweden as the great power of the north. The window to the west is now permanently secured.
So he has his city, he has his great military victory, now he's the emperor. In 1721, he officially takes the title Emperor of all Russia. But he's not just conquering land, he's conquering time and language itself. Let's talk about the reforms.
It is hard to overstate how deep these reforms went. He literally changed time.
Explain that.
Russia used to date its years from the supposed creation of the world. So for them, it was the year 7208. Peter decided to switch to the Julian calendar, like Europe. He just proclaimed that it was now the year 1700, dating from the birth of Christ.
And he moved New Year's.
Moved New Year's Day from September 1st to January 1st. He forced the entire country to sync its watch with Europe.
And the alphabet. Imagine a leader today saying, hey everyone, we're changing the font of the language.
It sounds absurd, but that's what he did. He simplified the old, complex Cyrillic alphabet, creating what's called the civil script. He wanted books to be more readable, more accessible, not just ornate religious texts. He introduced Arabic numerals to replace the clunky letter-based numbers they used.
He's building the infrastructure for a literate scientific society.
Step by step. But the biggest social change had to be the table of ranks.
This was revolutionary.
For centuries, your status in Russia depended entirely on your lineage. The boyars were the old, landed aristocracy. Peter hated that stagnation. He thought it was inefficient.
So he blew it up?
He blew it up. He introduced the table of ranks in 1722. It created a hierarchy of 14 grades for the military, the civil service, and the court. Everybody started at the bottom. If you served the state well, you moved up. If you reached the 8th rank, you became a hereditary noble, regardless of who your parents were.
So he's basically trying to create a meritocracy. He wants a startup culture in a feudal empire.
An excellent way to put it. But at the same time, he's dismantling the church's power. And this is where that Antichrist label really starts to stick for a lot of people.
Right, because the church was the other great power center in Russia.
The only other one, really. And Peter, well, he was religious in his own way. He sang in the choir, he knew the liturgy, but he despised the political power of the church hierarchy. So when the patriarch, the head of the Russian church, died, Peter simply refused to appoint a new one.
He just let the seat sit empty.
For years. Eventually, he abolished the patriarchate entirely and replaced it with something called the Holy Synod, which was a council of bishops effectively controlled by a government official he appointed. He turned the church into just another department of the state.
And we can't skip the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. What on earth was that?
It was. Well, it was bizarre. It was essentially a club Peter formed with his closest drinking buddies. They gave themselves mock religious titles. Peter's was proto-deacon. One of his friends was the Prince Pope.
And they held mock ceremonies.
Mock ceremonies that were really just elaborate drinking parties. They parodied church rituals, often involving massive amounts of alcohol and crude jokes.
Was he just blowing off steam?
Mm-hmm.
Or was he trying to make a point?
I think it was both. He was definitely mocking the stiffness and self-importance of the church, trying to drag it down to earth. But to the average Russian peasant, seeing the Tsar mock the Holy Liturgy, it looked demonic.
It would have been deeply shocking.
It reinforced the idea that this man wasn't a true pious Tsar, but maybe a German changeling or the devil himself.
It's such a contradiction. He's building churches in St. Petersburg, but he's mocking bishops in Moscow. He's advancing science, creating the Kunstkamera, his cabinet of curiosities with all those preserved monsters and deformities to debunk superstition.
But he's also ruling through absolute terrifying fear.
And nowhere is that fear more palpable or more tragic than within his own family.
No, his personal life is just as tumultuous as his public one.
Yeah, let's get into that. He didn't have great luck with wives initially.
His first marriage to Eudoxia Lopukina was arranged by his mother when he was very young. He hated it. She was traditional, conservative, pious, everything he was trying to destroy in Russia, he saw in her.
So what did he do?
He eventually just forced her into a convent, shipped her off to a nunnery to get her out of the way.
But then he meets Catherine. And this is like a Cinderella story, but with a lot more war and vodka.
Catherine I. She's an incredible story in her own right. She was a peasant, born Marta Skavronskaya, in what is now Latvia or Estonia.
So not a noble at all.
Not even close. She was a servant, maybe a laundry washer, who was captured by Russian troops during the war. She passed through the hands of a few officers and eventually caught Peter's eye.
And what was it about her?
She was illiterate, she was common, but she understood him in a way no one else did. She was the only person who could calm him down during his rages or when he had his seizures. She would just hold his head in her lap and speak to him softly until he fell asleep.
She was his partner.
His true partner. They married secretly at first, then officially. He even crowned her empress.
But then there's Alexei, his son from that first marriage, the heir to the throne.
The tragedy of Alexei is the tragedy of Peter's reign in microcosm. Alexei was everything Peter wasn't.
How so?
He was quiet, intellectual, deeply religious, and he preferred the old ways of Moscow. He didn't want to be a soldier. He didn't want to build ships. And more than anything, he was terrified of his father.
And Peter just bullied him, right? Relentlessly.
Relentlessly. Peter saw his son as a failure, as a threat to his legacy. He kept threatening to disinherit him, to send him to a monastery if he didn't shape up.
So what did Alexei do?
Terrified for his life, he did the unthinkable. In 1716, the heir to the Russian throne fled the country. He ran away. He went to Vienna to his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor, trying to hide from his own father.
Yeah, that's how scary Peter was. His own son, the Tsarevich, fled across a continent to get away from him.
Peter was incandescent with rage. This wasn't just a rebellious teen, this was a major political threat. Foreign powers could use Alexei as a figurehead, as a rallying point for all the anti-Peter sentiment to overthrow him.
So he had to get him back.
He sent his most cunning agents to track Alexei down, and they tricked him into coming back, promising him a full pardon. "Come home," they said. "Your father forgives you. All is forgiven."
And Alexei believed them. He came back, but there was no forgiveness.
No. As soon as Alexei was back on Russian soil, Peter had him arrested. He stripped him of his title as heir and set up an investigation, convinced there was a massive plot against him.
And then the unthinkable happened.
The Tsar's son was tortured. Peter allowed his own son to be whipped with the knout, to be interrogated under torture, to extract a confession of treason.
Did he confess?
He confessed to anything they wanted him to. He implicated his friends, his supporters, and eventually a court of officials sentenced him to death.
And Alexei dies in prison.
He died from the injuries he sustained during the torture just days before he was scheduled to be formally executed. Peter was fully prepared to execute his own son for the sake of the state.
It's just so cold. It really answers the question of his priorities, doesn't it?
It does.
The state comes first, above everything, even before family.
Absolutely. To Peter, Alexei wasn't just a son. He was a living symbol of the backward, traditional Russia that Peter was trying to kill. He believed that if Alexei took the throne, the navy would rot. St. Petersburg would be abandoned, and the beards would grow back. Peter couldn't let that happen. Not ever.
So after Alexei dies, Peter changes the succession law. He decrees that the reigning emperor can choose anyone he wants as successor. It doesn't have to be the eldest son.
Which is a move that backfires spectacularly, because in the end, he never names anyone.
Right. Let's go to the end. It's 1725. Peter's only 52 years old, but he's lived a hard life.
He's been running at 110% capacity for decades. His health is failing.
What was wrong with him?
He had serious bladder and urinary tract issues, probably uremia. It was a painful, slow decline.
But there's a legend about his death, isn't there? A story that fits the hero narrative a little better.
Yes, the legend says that in November of 1724, he saw a boat of soldiers that had overturned in the icy Gulf of Finland, and he supposedly waded into the freezing water himself to help rescue them.
Chest deep in the ice.
So the story goes. He got hypothermia, which worsened his existing infections, and that's what ultimately killed him.
Is it true?
Most historians are pretty skeptical. The timeline doesn't quite match up with the progression of his illness, and the only source for it is a much later, somewhat romanticized account. It's far more likely he just died from the natural progression of his infection.
But it's a good story.
It's a great story, and the legend exists because people wanted to believe he died as he lived, sacrificing his own body for his subjects, for his state.
And the final scene. He's on his deathbed. He knows the end is near. He asks for a pen and paper.
He manages to scrawl 2 words, leave all 2, and then he loses consciousness. The pen falls from his hand. He dies without finishing the sentence.
Leave all 2. Talk about a cliffhanger for an entire empire.
It threw Russia into decades of palace coups and instability, what historians call the era of palace revolutions, because nobody knew who was supposed to be in charge. His wife Catherine took over, but the line was unclear.
So let's try and wrap this all up. What is the final verdict? We have the bronze horseman statue in St. Petersburg, depicting him as this Roman-style hero, rearing his horse over the snake of treason.
We have someone like Stalin, who, centuries later, deeply admired Peter's methods.
And then we have the westernizers throughout Russian history who say he was a genius who made Russia a great European power.
And on the other side, we have the critics, the Slavophiles, the old believers, who say he fractured the Russian soul. He created this unbridgeable gap between the westernized elite, who spoke French and German, dressed like Parisians, and looked down on their own culture, and the vast peasantry who remained in the Middle Ages.
He modernized the state, but he strengthened serfdom to do it.
He built a great fleet, but he ruled by the knout and the executioner's axe. It's the ultimate ends justify the means debate.
Why did Stalin admire him so much?
Stalin admired him precisely because Peter proved that a single, ruthless, unbending will could force a backward country to become a superpower in a single generation. Stalin saw the state as a machine, and people were just cogs. If a cog didn't fit, like his own son or the Streltsy, you didn't fix it. You just crushed it and replaced it.
It's a terrifying precedent to set.
It is. Peter proved that you can change a culture by force. You can force a leap of centuries. But the cost is that the state becomes a kind of deity, an entity that is more important than any individual life.
So here's the question I want to leave you with today. If Peter hadn't done it, if he hadn't dragged Russia into the West by its beard, kicking and screaming, what would have happened?
It's the great unknown.
Would Russia have been colonized and carved up by Sweden or the Ottomans? Or would it have found its own, more organic, maybe less bloody path to modernity on its own terms?
That is the great what if of all of Russian history, and we will never ever know the answer. But if you ever find yourself in St. Petersburg, standing by the Neva River, looking up at that bronze horseman, just remember, you are looking at a monument to sheer, terrifying, world-changing will.
And that's our deep dive on Peter the Great. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.